Being here, I'm so excited to just share some thoughts and perhaps hear from you as well. And so thank you, Maita, for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Brian Merrick for the invitation, and thank you everyone for being here. This is really monumental and really exciting, and I look forward to just sharing some thoughts on how we continue the movement. So first, again, not only thank you to the students, but thank you to the faculty and staff also. I'm so humbled and honored to speak specifically in Dr. King's memory and legacy specific to human rights, justice, and equality. And so, again, we, even in this space, are holding up and continuing that great legacy. And so when I was asked to speak today, a number of thoughts rushed through my mind on where to begin or what to talk about specifically. We know, many of us, maybe his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech from 1963, that really set the tone for Americans to take a look at specifically how we are addressing racial, civic, and economic inequality. Some might have known I've been to the mountaintop speech, Dr. King's last speech in 1968, where he reflected on the history, used the powerful metaphor of the mountaintop to really demonstrate and give people the hope that we could reflect on. And so as I was reflecting personally on the brilliance of Dr. King, going from the dream to the mountaintop, it really cited me to look at my own life. And so Mike mentioned a number of things that I've been graced and humbled to do, and I cite Dr. King as one of my greatest inspirations. And so sharing a bit more about me personally, I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I was born and raised there. I moved to Los Angeles now about 13 years ago. The oldest of three brothers, raised by a single mother in the projects of North Baton Rouge. And those are all identities that I'm very proud of because they've helped really inform the person who I am today. And so, also, I was very different as a child, as a student. Different in the sense of I played the violin as a child all the way through college. I was a gymnast, I played soccer, I was in theater, all things that were not very specific to black boys in the South. And so I learned very early on not only what it was to be different, but how to use those differences to really power and channel the person that we know that we're designed to be. And it also takes a great deal of courage to be different. And I know many of the individuals in this room, as you are taking and embarking on wonderful journeys, there's continued invitations to do something different, to be something different, to really step outside the box. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. Maya Angelou says that courage is the most important of all virtues, because without courage, you cannot practice any other virtue consistently. And again, I'll say that courage is the most important virtue because without courage, one cannot practice any other virtue consistently. And so I believe that many of the virtues and values that we really guide and lead ourselves with are founded and girded in courage. So I mentioned, so much about me. I was this really different kid doing all these different activities and found not only that I was different, but there were a number of other individuals who also navigated the world very differently. And so we, this sort of intermittent group, became a tribe of sorts. And we were this group of individuals that didn't quite belong, or were trying to figure it out, or were very different from what we had known. And so we had become a movement in our own right, because we were moving and operating in a sense of authenticity in a time and a space where the world did not necessarily welcome authenticity in that same way. And so as a high schooler, as a teen, I increasingly became more outspoken. I kind of found my own way and kind of came into my own a bit. And my friends had deemed me the king of the misfits, because I was very much sort of the voice of the people, and people saw me and respected me, and I stood up for folks, and if folks were with me, they wouldn't get a hard time. And so that was also an identity that I really took pride in. And so moving along, and as I was moving throughout high school, I got the idea a senior year that I wanted to run for a senior class president. I figured I could be this king for everyone. And so my friends, we put together, they were my campaign team. We came together and we cut out buttons from construction paper and made posters from glitter and stickers. We were really just pulling together the very few resources we had to really create this wonderful experience. But I did not win. And I was upset, but then I realized that even in that, it was a win because we were able to really pull together a level of collaboration and belonging that without that experience might not have happened in the same way. And so when we look at life and we look at these opportunities to show up in the world, they might not always translate as traditional wins, but there's certainly elements of our lives that when they come together, they really do prove to work out just fine for us. What it also showed me is that there was a necessity to do something different for people who were different. And so there was a level of engagement and excitement that my group of friends, but then also the student body more broadly, really got excited about through this presidential campaign. And so that let me know too that we're also stronger together. And so while I did not win the role of class president, that certainly did inspire me personally to know that there's something that we can all bring when we bring our collective power. Thus is a movement. And so when we look at our own lives and the ways in which we get to show up in the world, we often think about movement leaders as big people who are on big stages and doing big things and using big words. But I would dare to say everyone in this room is a movement leader. And so when we think about the movement, a movement can be defined as something that exists to change people's lives. And you as students, you being in this room, you being committed to this work of equity, justice, inclusion, and diversity makes you a movement leader. And so when we look at how we're using those tools, those skills, those experiences to change lives, I dare say this is your invitation to look at what do you bring specifically to the work to continue to make change happen. Movement grows, movement challenges, movement changes. Reverend Sandy A. Wilson says, a movement is something that starts at the bottom, grows in the middle to challenge and change the top. And so when we look at how we're activating as movement leaders, there's a role and a space for each of us along the way. There's an analogy that I would give often, having done community organizing for some years, and there's often sort of one person at a podium, but there's a whole bunch of other people behind the scenes doing things, even this very room today. While I might be standing here, there was a number of folks who set the room up, who provided refreshments, who provided support and greeting at the door. Again, when we look at the movement, you might not necessarily be the person at the lectern, but you have a very valuable role. And so when we looked at and reflect on Dr. King's life, there were a number of great individuals that were a part of his life, that were a part of the wider movement, who often don't get the celebration and the accolades that Dr. King he himself received, but they stood alongside him in a very important and impactful way. And some of those leaders include Ella Baker, Dr. Dorothy Height, Diane Nash, and Bayard Rustin, folks who we'll talk a bit more about today, but again, recognizing that while Dr. King might be the figure that we remember most, he was surrounded by a team of individuals who was able to help move the work forward. And so even we in this room, as we're doing the work, recognizing that the work moves forward when we all take our rightful place. And so, reflecting more on Dr. King was not just a civil rights activist, he was a tribune for multiracial working class. So really looking at how we're engaging people, specifically those people who face poverty, people who experience racism, people who experience other injustices such as joblessness, and then how we'll be much more powerful when we bond together, when we work together, the tremendous power that comes when we pull our resources and our strengths together. And Dr. King was an example of how when we pull our strengths together, we see a much more impactful movement. He was surrounded by many individuals, and many of these individuals were women. And it was in a time when women were given much less opportunity and space to elevate their voices. However, these women brought their skills, strengths, and passion to the work in a way in which I said we owe it to them to continue to build upon the legacy that they have invested in, even though they were in the shadows for many years. So again, what does it mean to be a movement? We think about such figures as Mrs. Coretta Scott King herself, the wife of Dr. King. Mrs. King was at just about all of the marches and demonstrations alongside her husband, Dr. King. And not only that, she was also responsible for caring for the family and children. And so that speaks again to the intersectional, not only identities, but ways in which we contribute to the movement. And I dare say without Mrs. King, there would not have been a Dr. King. And so again, recognizing that she was able to balance a sense of the movement in a way that he himself could not. And so again, that is an invitation and a reminder to us that we have specific opportunities to really show up as a part of the movement, as movement leaders, to bring a very specific skill, strength, and interest to the movement. Mrs. King committed her life well after her husband's assassination to continue the work. We know that she was continuing to spread the philosophy of Dr. King well throughout the rest of her life, and then a vocal advocate specifically to equity, more specifically around HIV, LGBTQ issues, and women's issues. And again, we were able to see how those movements were birthed out of the philosophies that Dr. King was so dynamic in creating. And so again, this is an invitation and reminder to us as well that so many movements are connected. And we have the invitation to look at, as we explore what we bring to the world, what is my thing? How do I use my thing and take it to the masses? I know, like Maita mentioned, we had a big demonstration in 2020 that I was graced to be the leader of. And there were a lot of people who were saying, I'm not really a picket sign kind of person, or I'm not really a yelling in the street kind of person. But this is your invitation to look at, well, what is your role? To find your role and then to own it without apology, because at the same time, there is a very specific group of folks who are vocal demonstrators, but then along with that, there's a host of other needs that we have as movement leaders as we do this work. And so thinking about Mrs. King's also, and how she had a very integral role in the movement, even though we might not have seen as much of her as we saw of Dr. King. Also, when we think about the movement, we think about individuals like Ella Baker. Her name is not as well known as it should be, but she was also a very key figure in the civil rights movement. Ms. Baker was a brilliant civil rights leader, and she was key in the freedom movement, and also helping to guide and inspire other leaders. So a great part of what her contribution to the movement was is she was able to support and train and equip those who were much more vocal and present, including Dr. King himself. And so I encourage folks to look up Miss Ella Baker. She was integral in many of the strategies that Dr. King used, many of the approaches that Dr. King used, and a host of other leaders as well were able to glean from Miss Baker's strategies. She was really closely connected to a number of institutions, such as the NAACP, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was Dr. King's organization, but run by Ms. Baker. And again, folks don't know that, specifically because the Times very disproportionately underrepresented women's contributions to society, and even more so Black women and women of color. But Ms. Baker dedicated her life to the work and to the movement. And she continued that work well into the elder years of her life. And one quote by John Hope Franklin, who's a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called Ms. Baker probably the most courageous and most selfless of the activists in the 1960s. And this is the woman's name that many of us might not have known, but she was so key and integral, not only to the work at the time, but many of the strategies and tactics that we use to this day. And again, lifting these individuals, not only to bring them into the space, but also to encourage you as well as you are doing the work. Teachers, educators, individuals who are able to train and connect are invaluable members of the movement. And I would often say too, is that when we do see demonstrators, they are the product of a teacher. And so many of us might not necessarily show up in some traditional ways, but as we are exploring, look at what does non-traditional ways to show up look like. Another dynamic woman specifically in the movement is Dr. Dorothy Height. This was another woman who committed her life to the movement as well. She served as the president of the National Council of Negro Women for over 40 years, and this is an organization, as the name denotes, was specifically, and is still specifically, committed to really elevating equity for Black women and girls, and women more broadly. Many folks don't know, but Dr. Height was actually the only woman who was a part of the convening and organizing body of the March on Washington in 1963. She also, while she was a dynamic speaker and orator, she was invited to sit on the stage or stand on stage next to Dr. King, but was not allowed to speak. And this was, again, one of the most dynamic women in modern organizing history, and served well into her senior years as well. The march drew upwards of 250,000 demonstrators, and a great deal of that was through the organizing of women like Dr. Height. President Obama calls Dr. Height the godmother of the civil rights movement. And so I encourage you to look up Dr. Height, again, a dynamic woman who was active and visible and a strong contributor, and on whose shoulders we stand as we do this work going forward. And so when we think about the movement today, we mentioned a number of historic individuals and folks who have done dynamic work specific to equity. Today we might call that work activism. And so when we're looking at how do we get to show up in the work, activism is now our invitation to continue the legacy of equity, equality, and justice that we stand on the shoulders of. When we think about activism, activism can be defined as the use of direct and noticeable action to receive a result. So when we think about activism, you can't have activism without the action. And so we listed a number of ways in which one can get active. And so again, this is an invitation for the room as well as we continue not only to commemorate Dr. King this month and so forth, but how do we get active on a daily basis? How do we bring activism into our lives? And we know, just following current and popular culture, there's a lot of places where we can get active. There's a lot of things that need our attention, and it might not necessarily be one segment or specific or another, but there's a space in which your voice, your skills, your contribution is very, very valuable. And so as we think about next steps on activism, this is an invitation to ask myself, where do I want to get active? Even as students, part of your activism today is being here. So you're already active in the work. And so asking yourself too, how do I continue on this? How do I build on this? How do I elevate this? And it might not come overnight, or it might not come as readily as others, or it might evolve. You know, when Mike kind of mentioned my journey, I had a lot of stops along the way, but they all sort of served the one before. My grandmother, who I cite as one of my greatest inspirations even to this day, even though she's been long since passed away, she would say that life is a journey, and along the way, you're picking flowers along your journey. And each of those flowers creates a beautiful bouquet. And your bouquet will look very different from any others because you picked certain flowers along your journey. And such is our own lives. There are certain things that we pick and keep, certain things we don't, certain things we throw out, certain things wither away. But there's this beautiful invitation we have to really look at what serves me now, what serves the work now, what serves the next version of myself. And so exciting to see so many dynamic young folks really committed to that, even just as being students and being activists in this room. That's your ongoing invitation to really look at how do I continue to use this chapter to serve me now and beyond. And so thinking more about activism, when we apply it to human rights, activism means defending human rights wherever they are threatened or violated and at whatever level. And so again, human rights, I say this all the time in the work that I do at the Amana Institute, is that one does not have to identify as a community to be invested in the wellness of that community. And so I've been able to work with a number of initiatives, women's work and youth work and formerly incarcerated work, and don't identify as any of those communities. But there's a way in which we can show up to really be an active contributor to the movement. And so when we're looking at human rights, activism is not only is reacting to injustice, to abusive treatment, to violence, and to discrimination, and then looking at either how to correct it or how to dismantle it and rebuild it. Because not all things are meant to be sustained in the way in which they are. This might be an invitation specifically as we look at activism, a chance to look at how might I help reimagine what this inequity is, and bringing your skills, strengths, and interests to the work to do exactly that. Another key figure who I also cite as a personal inspiration, mentioned his name, but Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was an openly black gay man who stood at the intersections of many fights of equality. He was a brilliant strategist and forward-thinking civil rights activist, and used many of his techniques to model what we knew as the freedom rides of the 1960s. And he's also been deemed as the architect of the March on Washington in 1963. There's a recent movie entitled by the name Rustin that really unfolds the story of Mr. Rustin in a way that really adds humanity to his contribution to the movement. But Rustin was one of the greatest activists and organizers in our time, and he challenged authority without apology. And so when we look at LGBTQ plus people and women, that's often the movement we've seen for those communities have been when representatives have said, we've had enough, we're doing something different. And so part of the movement work might be the assessment of, we've had enough of this, we're doing something different. And so Mr. Rustin dared to do something different in a world that said otherwise. And so a famous quote that he proclaimed is that we need, in every community, a group of angelic troublemakers. And so what that statement encapsulates is that at the essence of transformative power, there are individuals who change the norm, who change and challenge societal norms and fight for justice. And so I just say this is an invitation as well to be angelic troublemakers. And that could look very, very different. But again, when we look at moving the work, continuing the work, so much of it really looks at what is my role in the fight for injustice? And how might I even challenge norms? There was a time that many of us, the communities we represent, had a different experience than we have now. And that is because there were great angelic troublemakers who made a decision that while I might not be able to reap the full benefit now, I know it can't always be this. And so when we look at the great individuals that we covered today, a lot of what we are reaping today is because of their boldness, their courage, and their commitment to see change that they might not have to even experience for themselves. And so something that I say often too is that this work also is an invitation to go places you might not normally go. And those might not be necessarily physical places. Those might be ways of thinking. Those might be types of relationships. Those might be challenging one's own ways of thinking. I know, like I mentioned, I've done some work with formerly incarcerated and justice-impacted communities. And that was a certain, transparently, that was a certain mindset I had about justice-involved individuals, and that was really the invitation to challenge my stereotypes, challenge my generalizations and preconceptions, even if they weren't ill-intended, because sometimes they aren't ill-intended. But that, again, when we look at how we're able to show up, specifically for communities we don't represent, we must be vulnerable enough to invite ourselves or be invited into spaces that we might not normally go. And challenge and change can be difficult. Like was mentioned, I was raised in the South, and there's a very sort of prescribed experience for certain folks, as a man, or as a black person, or as a person from a certain side of town, or there's all these sort of prescriptions that society has given us that we didn't ourselves adopt. And I'm sure many of us, actually probably most of us, can speak to a prescription that we did not assign for ourselves. But this is our invitation not only to challenge, but to look forward. And so moving into a call to action, and I'll move along because I would love to hear if folks have any comments or questions or or anything of the like. But when we talk about standing on the shoulders of great individuals, it's our reminder that there's still work to be done. And so we just mentioned just a few individuals who have done dynamic work, but the list goes on, many whose names will never be written in history books or spoken over a lectern. And so this is just our reminder, and I dare say responsibility to continue that work. And until age and gender and race and class and who we love and all these things are not overshadowing who we are, that's a reminder that there's still work to be done. And so a quote that Dr. King says is that everyone can be great because everyone can serve. And so when we are committed to doing the work, we're committed to service. And our greatness comes through service, not the other way around. And so when we can bring ourselves to work and knowing that we have a very specific and unique role in the movement, that is how we serve. And so again, this is your reminder to look at what is my contribution to service. And we must really open our eyes and our hearts to look at how I allow myself to show up in service to the world. And again, that's that invitation to really assess what do I bring and what am I committed to bringing and what am I committed to bringing consistently, knowing that there is generations afar off from us and not very far off. Many of us who have younger siblings or children know that the world in which they will live in strongly stands on the world we create for them now. And so this is, again, that invitation to be reminded that we must open not only our hearts, but our eyes also, and know that there's a great responsibility to bring skill and tact to the work also. And so, I mentioned being in community organizing for years, and there's a pocket of folks who are just like, well, we don't want to talk about it, we're just going. However, there is a great deal of value that comes with strategy. And so again, not policing how we demonstrate, but knowing that when we can move strategically, we can move things in a way that we could not if we are not. And so today we remember the life and legacy of Dr. King, but we also remember the life and legacy of those dynamic women who stood alongside him, who did wonderful work, LGBTQ plus people and other people of color who did dynamic work, and individuals whose names we might not ever know. But again, knowing that as those women energized and mobilized and supported and lifted the work, we have that opportunity and invitation as well. And I'd say when we can show up unapologetic and when we can show up authentic, we are doing the work. And so we continue to do the work by turning our allyship into activism. And so looking very specifically at what the two of those look like differently, allyship is support. Allyship is support for diversity, support for communities outside of our own. But again, this is an invitation to move into activism. And activism is bringing that support into action and really asking yourself, what is my action? What am I putting my hands to? What am I putting my resources to in a way that really moves us to a solution? And again, you as bright minds and students who are really committed to this work, I'm very confident that those solutions live in this room. And so it's really quite the privilege to know that there are dynamic young leaders who are committed to moving the world forward, standing on the great shoulders of individuals who have done work often very thanklessly and under-resourced. And so as we're reminded that, and as we continue the movement, we should be reminded that the movement is not done alone. And so as we're doing this work, knowing that we're stronger together, finding ways in which we can collaborate and align ourselves in a way that will be of service, knowing too that when we are able to pool and channel our strengths together, that we can do exponential things. And so the community needs us. The community needs this room of activists. The community needs you. The community needs what you have. The movement needs us. The world needs us. And it depends on us. And so, today we had a wonderful time to commemorate Dr. King and some of those great individuals who are far gone. But this is, again, a call to the leaders in this room as well to know that we have a beautiful opportunity to bring our diversity, our love, our authenticity, and our commitment to the work to continue moving it along. And so as we move and bring this time together to a close, I just really want us to be reminded that it's time to use our voices, it's time to use our hearts, it's time to use our hands, and it's time to use our skills. And a phrase that I say often, and that I'll wrap this up just so I can have some time for maybe some thoughts. It's a phrase that came to me years ago, and it has guided my work and continues to guide it to this day, and I'll leave it with you as well. It says that none of us have to do everything if all of us do something. And so with that, just be reminded that your something is very valuable, your something is very needed, and thank you for your commitment to moving the work forward. Thank you.
I have the mic I can pass around if folks have questions or thoughts. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
So when I think of Dr. King's life, I see America as a country that was changing almost towards progress. But when I see the country today, it seems like it's regressing. And a lot of the attacks on civil rights are coming from the top of the institutions. So how can we learn from Dr. King's life and the way he organized, the way he thought about community, to make sure that this attack is countered and we still move in the direction of progress?
Thank you for that, because I think that's very dynamic and very real. We're seeing just quite a shift in the country, and I think we can look at it, to your question, from a two-pronged approach. I think we can look at it through the lens of what have been proven strategies on how we dismantle and address institutions, and at the same time, paralleling with how are we building, uplifting, and elevating individuals as well. And so as we're bringing the machines and the system down, we should be uplifting the people, and that might be through education, that might be through jobs, that might be through access to any number of things. But as we really look to level those, I think those are approaches that were steeped in Dr. King's teachings. A lot of times, folks, don't quite talk about, so much of what Dr. King was speaking around was equity and access to jobs, to housing, to education, along with the machine. So I think we have this invitation to do just that. And then also looking at what is our contribution. Some of us might not be both. We might be only in the empowering and educating the people side. Some of us might just be in the dismantling and addressing the institution side. Or some of us might be somewhere in the middle. But I think really being able to look at, without apology, finding what your contribution to the movement is, and then galvanizing with other people who have those similar and like-minded commitments will continue to move us forward in a way in which we certainly do need. So thank you for the question.
All right. Anyone else? All right.
Thank you.
This is Nancy. Thank you so much for your talk today. When you were speaking about the people in the movement of the 60s who were less visible than Dr. King, and then your final comments on strategy, it just brought home for me that in the midst of the movement, there were groups who had rights that they too wanted to fight for and needed to be addressed, deserved to be addressed, but thinking about which issues that would be prioritized, that would get action and attention first, many people maybe were told that they had to wait or that would come later. So my question is, how do you keep those groups engaged and excited about the movement that is in progress, even though they've heard in the past that their own fights aren't going to be addressed right then and there, and they may be tired about hearing, your time is coming, or you're next, or later.
Yeah, that's a dynamic question and dynamic offering, and we've certainly experienced that throughout history. A couple things I would certainly offer, and I speak to this often with my teams also, the approach of vision, strategy, implementation. So a lot of times when we're moving into the work, we can kind of see afar out, and we're very excited and we're sort of chugging toward the horizon. But the strategy is each of those steps and turns that moves us into the horizon. And so, we as movement leaders should be really mindful of ensuring that there is inclusion in the strategy. And then there's communication and messaging that speaks to that as well. And so when we look at, to use your example, there's a sort of greater good that asks certain sub-communities to, in essence, deprioritize their individual needs. There must be, and this is, a call to us who do the work to ensure that there is parallel movement in that way and not necessarily linear movement. And so that's certainly an invitation in that well. And I dare say, too, just having been in multiple seats, is that there's a specific role in morale that comes into organizing, because people are often bringing their whole selves and their lived experiences and their trauma and their pain into the space. And so there's a great deal of contribution that comes to those who comes from those who are the healers and the people who pray and people who houses of faith and nurses, and there's all these sort of care elements of activism that oftentimes are deprioritized but are essential when we look at burnout and trauma and any host of other mental and emotional issues. And so to your question, there certainly needs to be a strategy that is actively, inclusive of what those communities look like, but then also holding space for people's humanity along the way as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. On a similar note, there was recent news of Dr. Antoinette Candia-Bailey, the Vice President of Student Affairs at Lincoln University, who recently took her own life. And to me, this just reminded me of kind of the struggle of how far progress seems sometimes, especially when we're talking about activism and social justice. So I was wondering how you managed to maintain a support system throughout your work, throughout your career, and how to take care of your mental health when progress sometimes seems so far away.
Yes, thank you for that. And I truly hold space with you, not for you, but with you. I understand, and thank you for your leadership in this moment. So to your question, it is certainly a priority. It is certainly one that has increasingly so become a priority. So Mike did mention that I'm also an elder of my church. I'm a man of faith, and my faith has been a strong pillar in what allows me to continue to do this work, because it is very much overwhelming. And when we have to navigate a world and spaces that see us as inhuman or not worth being alive, that is very impacting. And so I connect with things that bring me joy and prioritize joy without apology. There's been a whole sort of chapter of my life where joy was deprioritized, and it was sort of a badge of honor. I'm out here hustling and grinding, and I'm tired, and I'm mad, and my jaw's clenched. It adds no value. And so I say to activists and to those of us who are movement leaders, put you first. As a minister, I often will say, you are your first ministry. And so you can't be anything to anybody that you're not being to yourself first. And being connected to care and resources that allow you to move to that space. And so I'm a big advocate for therapy. I'm a big advocate for connecting. I say that it's a both and. You can have God and a therapist. You can have nature and a therapist. You can have all of the above. The whole bouquet analogy I apply to my faith and healing journey as well. There are ancestral practices that are part of my journey. There is nature practices. There's Christian practices, but finding what works and keeps you alive and connecting to a community that can really hold you in a way that is authentic. And knowing when you need to, I say this too just as one of my personal practices too. I'm not a therapist, just kind of a disclaimer. But an exercise I do is I check in with 7-year-old Gerald. And so what that is at the core of you, at the simplest version of you, that's a very simple answer for what you need. And when you ask a little kid, 3 or 4, what do you need? They can very succinctly say what they need. I need a nap. I'm tired. I don't like it here. I'm hot. Something very simple. I need to use the restroom. And a lot of times it's like, when you can really check in with yourself, it's like, I'm tired. Give yourself that. check in with your younger self and honor her.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I will. Well, okay. How do you speak to like disagreement within a group? You know what I mean? Like similar, like questions. Like you don't, or like it may not be on the same way, but like how do you like respectfully like disagree, or times that you have to like respectfully disagree with what someone else might be doing, or you know like.
Yeah, that's a great question too, and that's part of the organizing strategies. Is I'll say, you know, from my perspective, is knowing what my role is and what it isn't. And sometimes it's to convince folks, and sometimes it's to sway folks. Sometimes it's not. They got a whole bunch of people who need what I got to say. If it ain't you, it just ain't you. And so, like, knowing a lot of times we will forfeit the masses to try to sway one or two people. Knowing what your role is, those of us who are called to be the swayers, I encourage you, like we said, make sure you're supported, make sure you have the tools, skills, and strategy, make sure you have partners who can really sort of uplift you in that. And then too, I mean, not to even be cliche, but just, you know, knowing which battles to fight. And, you know, there's just only so much, you know, we ourselves, there's only so much of us as a resource to go around. And I kind of give the analogy to some of my team, is think of your life as like a pie or pizza. In order for somebody to get a bigger slice, somebody has to get a smaller slice. And that might mean you got less to give with the arguing and more to give for the nurturing, the movement, leadership, and taking care of yourself. Thank you.
Anyone else? Join me in giving another round of applause for our Keynote speakers. To wrap up really quickly, Gerald mentioned a few wonderful civil rights leaders, and we actually have a book giveaway in the CCID, so if you RSVP for the event today, it's still on our website. Please go there and add your name. They'll do a random selection of folks who will read who will be able to be gifted to give away those 4 books. They're on Ella Baker, Dorothy Irene Height, John Lewis, and they are Reston. Just really quickly, a story even how I came across Ella Baker. Summer of 2008, I was going to my senior year of college, and I was participating in something called Freedom Schools. Has anyone ever heard of Freedom Schools? Oh, you have? Great. And then we were being trained as servant leader interns from Ella Baker trainers. And so ever since then, I've always like, everybody look into Ella Baker, look into Ella Baker. So thank you all for coming to another year of MLK Week events. We hope that you all will join us for the next event, which is on Saturday, which is a service event, and future Caltech Y and CCID events. Please find out more information on our social media pages and on our websites. We have more food, please take it. And we have goodies in the back. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was
Yes.
a great invitation. I think that we all need to hear.
Oh, good. That means so much. And thank you for your great partnership throughout this whole process. Yeah. And your leadership.
Wow.
Yeah. Over the last 30 plus years. We'll keep throwing that out there. But
Thank you so much. Yes. Yes.
Right. Oh.
All the best too.